The night before the housewarming, my son-in-law looked me dead in the eye and told me I did not fit in. He thought he was putting a poor, uneducated old man in his place. He had absolutely no idea he was insulting the man who actually owned the very ground he was standing on. By the end of the weekend, he would lose everything and I would be the one holding the keys. He never saw it coming. My name is Anton Pierce. I am 69 years old and I spent my entire life building an empire in silence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth based on the color of your skin or the clothes on your back. Now let me tell you exactly how a simple kitchen towel started a war I was more than ready to finish. It was a Friday evening the night before the grand housewarming party at the massive $4 million mansion my daughter Kendra and her husband Blake had just moved into. The house was immaculate, a sprawling modern estate with floor-to-ceiling windows and imported marble countertops. I was standing in the kitchen quietly wiping down a small spill on the island with a damp cloth, just trying to be helpful. That is when Blake walked in. He was 34, a white tech entrepreneur who wore expensive silk shirts and a constant look of superiority. He stopped his eyes scanning my faded jeans and worn-out flannel shirt with obvious disgust. Without a word, he marched over, snatched the towel right out of my hand, and threw it hard against my chest. It fell to the floor. I looked up at him, maintaining my composure. "You do not fit in here, Anton," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Tomorrow night, this house is going to be filled with top-tier investors. People with actual money, class, and influence. Your look, your presence, it just does not match the aesthetic we are going for. You are going to embarrass me. You can stay in the guest house out back during the party, or better yet, just go back to your own place." He crossed his arms, waiting for me to argue, waiting for me to act like the small, powerless man he truly believed I was. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or clench my fists. I simply stared at this arrogant man who thought his leased sports cars and fake smiles made him a king. I slowly bent down, picked up the damp towel from the spotless hardwood floor, and tossed it into the stainless steel trash can. Then I untied the apron I had put on to help with the dishes, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. I nodded slowly, turning my back on him, and walked toward the door. I had endured this man for 3 long years. 3 years of passive-aggressive racism, subtle jabs at family dinners, and outright disrespect. And I took every single ounce of it for one reason alone. Kendra. My daughter was 32 years old, and since her mother Camille passed away 2 decades ago, Kendra had been my entire world. She had fallen blindly in love with Blake and his illusion of success. I chose to swallow my pride so I would not lose my relationship with my only child. Kendra thought I was just a retired, struggling old man who lived off a modest pension. She had no idea that I had spent 40 years building a massive logistics and real estate empire from the ground up. I chose to live in my simple single-story house because I wanted to teach my daughter the value of hard work, not the entitlement of wealth. I hid my true identity to protect her from men exactly like Blake. What Blake did not know, what he was too blind and arrogant to ever investigate, was that the $4 million mansion he was standing in was purchased through a blind trust, a trust that I fully funded and controlled. He thought he was the master of the house, completely unaware that he was living on my dime. As I walked out the back door, the cool night air hit my face. My patience had completely run out. Blake had finally crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I was no longer going to play the role of the quiet, accommodating father-in-law. I walked down the pristine, perfectly paved driveway and climbed into my beat-up 20-year-old Ford pickup truck. The engine sputtered to life, a loud, gritty sound that shattered the quiet elegance of the upscale neighborhood. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my mind working like a chess grandmaster setting up the final moves of a match. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before he answered. "Bradley." "It is Anton," I said, my voice cold and steady. Bradley Cole was my wealth manager and personal attorney. We had worked together for over 20 years navigating ruthless corporate buyouts and complex real estate acquisitions. He knew my tone meant business. "Anton, it is late. What do you need?" he asked, immediately dropping his casual demeanor. "I need you to run a complete ruthless audit on Blake Harrington," I told him as I put the truck in gear and drove away from the mansion. "I want every single piece of financial data you can legally and quietly extract. I want his bank accounts, his shell companies, the actual metrics of his tech startup, his credit card debt, everything. I want his entire life on paper by tomorrow morning." Bradley paused for only a second. "You have always let him play his games for Kendra's sake." "What changed?" "He told me I do not fit in," I replied, staring at the road ahead. "He told me to stay in the guest house, so I would not embarrass him in front of his wealthy friends." "I think it is time we find out exactly how wealthy Blake really is." "Consider it done," Bradley said. "I will put my best people on it tonight. I will call you as soon as I have the preliminary files." I hung up the phone and drove through the city. I thought about the way Blake always flaunted his lifestyle. The designer suits, the expensive dinners, the constant boasting about his startup securing another round of funding. In my 40 years of business, I had learned one undeniable truth. The men who scream the loudest about their wealth are usually the ones drowning in debt. Real power is silent. Real wealth does not need to show off. I arrived at my modest brick house, unlocked the front door, and walked into the quiet living room. I made myself a cup of black coffee and sat at my worn wooden dining table. The silence of my home was a stark contrast to the storm that was brewing in my mind. I was ready to dismantle his entire life. It was a little past 2 in the morning when my phone finally vibrated on the wooden table. The screen lit up with Bradley's name. I answered immediately, taking a sip of my dark coffee. "Anton," Bradley said, his voice tight and incredibly serious. I pulled the files. "You were right to be suspicious. What did you find?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair. "Your son-in-law is not just arrogant, Anton. He is completely bankrupt." Bradley let out a heavy sigh before continuing. "His tech startup is a ghost town. It is nothing but a hollow shell. He has maxed out every single line of credit he has, and he is dodging calls from private lenders. He does not have a dime to his name." A cold, hard realization washed over me. Blake was a drowning man desperately trying to look like he was walking on water. He was using my daughter and my money to keep up an illusion. And tomorrow night, at the biggest party of his life, surrounded by the people he wanted to impress the most, I was going to let him sink straight to the bottom. At exactly 6 in the morning, the heavy thud of a courier dropping a thick sealed envelope on my front porch echoed through the quiet house. I was already awake, nursing my second cup of black coffee. I brought the envelope inside and spread the documents across my worn oak dining table. Bradley had outdone himself. The pages detailed every financial breath Blake Harrington had taken over the last 5 years. I flipped through the bank statements, the tax returns, and the corporate filings for his so-called revolutionary tech startup. It was a masterpiece of deception. Blake had secured 2 rounds of seed funding based on inflated user metrics and fabricated partnerships. Now the capital was completely gone. He had burned through millions to maintain his lifestyle, leasing luxury cars, buying bespoke suits, and flying first class, all while his company produced absolutely nothing of value. The servers were empty. The payroll consisted of a few contractors who had not been paid in months. He was not a tech visionary. He was a corporate parasite living on borrowed time and stolen money. His credit cards were maxed out to the absolute limit, and he was dodging calls from aggressive private lenders who were threatening severe consequences. The man who had sneered at my flannel shirt and called me an embarrassment was financially bleeding to death. I felt a cold surge of vindication, but it was quickly eclipsed by a deep protective rage. He had dragged my daughter into this fragile house of cards. Looking at Blake's pathetic excuse for a business, I could not help but think back to my own beginnings. 40 years ago, I did not have venture capitalists handing me millions of dollars based on a slick presentation and a smooth-talking pitch. I had a single rusted delivery box truck and a promise I made to my late wife, Camille. We lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment that smelled of exhaust and pure ambition. I drove that truck 18 hours a day, sleeping in the cab at truck stops, taking every low-paying freight contract the big companies refused to touch. I built Pierce Global Logistics mile by grueling mile. When I finally bought my second truck, I drove both myself and my schedule into the ground. When I secured my first warehouse, I swept the floors myself because I could not afford a janitor. I never took a single dime I did not earn, and I never spent a dime I did not have to. Over 4 decades, that single truck evolved into an international fleet. The small warehouse became a massive network of distribution centers spanning 3 continents. My net worth quietly climbed into the hundreds of millions. But when Camille got sick and passed away, the money suddenly felt entirely meaningless. It could not cure her. It could not buy us more time. That is when I made the conscious decision to step away from the public eye. I appointed trusted executives to run the daily operations, retained my position as the anonymous chairman of the board, and moved back into the modest brick house Camille and I had purchased when we were young. I wanted Kendra to grow up grounded. I wanted her to understand that character is built through adversity, not handed to you on a silver platter. I wore faded jeans and drove a 20-year-old Ford because I no longer had anything to prove to anyone. I knew exactly who I was and what I possessed. Blake, on the other hand, was an empty vessel that clinked loudly. He constructed his entire identity around the perception of wealth, completely blind to the fact that the quiet, unassuming black man he treated like the hired help could buy his entire existence with a single phone call. He measured a man's worth by the brand of his watch, failing to realize my calloused hands held more power than his entire lineage. But my quiet reflection abruptly ended when I turned to the second folder Bradley had provided. This one was labeled Personal Liabilities, and the very first page made my blood run absolutely cold. Blake was not just failing in his business, he was actively stealing from my daughter to cover his tracks. The document in front of me was a pending loan application. Blake was attempting to take out a massive $2 million mortgage. The collateral for this desperate loan was the new $4 million mansion he and Kendra had just moved into, the very mansion where he was hosting his lavish housewarming party tonight. The audacity of this move was staggering, and it proved exactly how dangerously arrogant he had become. 3 months ago, when Kendra told me they found their dream home, she confessed they could not secure the traditional financing because Blake's assets were supposedly tied up in his company. As a silent gift, I instructed Bradley to use one of my holding companies to purchase the estate outright and place it in a blind trust. The trust granted Kendra and Blake full residential rights, making them appear as the owners to the outside world, but legally, the property remained under my absolute control. Blake had no idea. He genuinely believed that his manipulative charm and Kendra's signature on a few closing documents made him the master of the domain. Now, the paperwork showed he was exploiting a dangerous loophole. He had somehow convinced a shady, high-interest private lending firm that he held the equity. He had forged corporate guarantees, falsified property deeds, and was using the perceived value of the estate to secure the $2 million in cash. He needed this massive injection of capital to pay off the angry investors from his failed startup before they pursued criminal fraud charges against him. He was literally trying to leverage a house I owned to save his own skin, putting Kendra at risk of losing her home and taking on a massive fraudulent debt that would ruin her financial future forever. He was using the shelter I provided for my child as a gambling chip in his pathetic corporate casino. I stared at the forged signatures on the documents, feeling a new level of disgust. This was no longer just about a disrespectful son-in-law. This was a criminal conspiracy targeting my own flesh and blood. He had crossed from being a terrible husband into being a dangerous liability. If this loan went through, Kendra would be legally tied to a fraudulent mortgage, completely unaware that the ground beneath her feet was about to collapse. I flipped to the final page of the loan agreement, and a grim, ruthless smile spread across my face. The private lender required a final in-person verification and digital signature to disperse the funds. According to Bradley's intercepted emails, the representative from the lending firm was scheduled to attend the housewarming party tonight, disguised as a VIP investor. Blake was planning to finalize the $2 million transaction right under Kendra's nose, celebrating his fraudulent victory while sipping expensive champagne in a house he did not even own. The money was set to be transferred to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands the very moment the digital ink dried. He was not just trying to save his business. He was preparing to cut and run. I looked at the clock on my kitchen wall. It was 7 in the morning. The party started at 8 tonight. I had exactly 13 hours to dismantle his life completely and protect my daughter from a devastating financial ruin. I picked up my phone and hit Bradley's speed dial. The countdown had officially begun. I told Bradley to prepare the legal countermeasures and hung up the phone. I could not wait until tonight to protect my daughter from the disaster waiting for her. I grabbed my keys and immediately dialed Kendra's number. She answered with a groggy voice, clearly surprised to hear from me so early in the morning. I told her we needed to talk urgently and asked her to meet me at a small, quiet diner downtown, far away from her new upscale neighborhood and any prying eyes. I arrived early, sitting in a faded vinyl booth with a mug of black coffee watching the front door. When Kendra finally walked in, my heart ached. She looked exhausted, her usually bright eyes shadowed by a heavy stress she was trying hard to conceal behind expensive designer sunglasses and a meticulously styled coat. She sat across from me, ordering an espresso and immediately checking her phone with frantic energy. I reached across the table and gently placed my calloused hand over hers, forcing her to pause and look at me. "Kendra, I need you to listen to me very carefully." I began, keeping my voice low and steady. "I know you think Blake is a highly successful man, but things are not what they seem. He is in serious financial trouble. I have seen the proof. He is drowning in debt, and he is trying to use your new house to dig himself out." I watched her face closely, hoping the intelligent, fiercely independent girl I raised would see the truth. Instead, her posture stiffened immediately. She pulled her hand away from mine, her expression shifting from exhaustion to sharp defensiveness. "Dad, stop it right now," she whispered harshly, glancing around the diner as if my words alone were a public scandal. "You have never liked Blake, and you are always just looking for reasons to tear him down." I shook my head, my chest tightening with frustration. "This is not about whether I like him, Kendra. This is about facts. His tech company is a hollow shell. He has no money. He is a desperate man." Kendra slammed her coffee cup onto the saucer, the ceramic clattering loudly against the table. "Do not talk about my husband like that." She snapped, her voice trembling with a toxic mix of anger and blind loyalty. "He is under a massive amount of pressure right now. The industry is ruthless, and he has wealthy investors breathing down his neck. He is working day and night to build our future, and instead of supporting us, you come here and make up vicious lies." Then she looked at my faded flannel shirt and work boots, her eyes narrowing with a familiar imported disdain. A disdain she had learned entirely from the man she married. "Honestly, Dad, you are the one causing problems. Blake told me exactly what happened last night in the kitchen. He was incredibly stressed about the housewarming party, and you were just standing there wiping counters like the hired help. You made him deeply uncomfortable. You embarrassed him with your country behavior." She leaned in closer, her words sharp and coated in the arrogance of her husband. "You know these people coming tonight are important. They are high society elite investors. And you show up looking like you just crawled out from under a broken-down delivery truck. You do not fit into his world, and you refuse to even try. It is humiliating for him to introduce you." Hearing my own daughter echo the racist, classist garbage of a white con artist who was actively robbing her was a severe physical blow. The pain radiating through my chest was suffocating. I had spent my entire life building an empire in the shadows to shield her from exactly this kind of manipulation. Yet here she was, fiercely defending a man who saw her as nothing more than a convenient pawn. She was completely brainwashed, repeating his vile lies as if they were the gospel truth. "You think you understand his corporate world, but you simply do not." Kendra continued, her tone softening slightly into a patronizing lecture that made my stomach turn. "Blake is a visionary. He just needs a little financial runway to finalize his next big project. He is brilliant, Dad, and he trusts me to stand by him when things get tough. That is what a real partnership looks like. In fact, I am the only one who truly believes in him right now." She lifted her chin, a gesture of misguided pride that signaled her complete surrender to his control. "I know he is dealing with a temporary cash flow issue. He was completely honest with me about it last week. So I stepped up to help him." I froze, the ambient noise of the diner around me seeming to fade into absolute terrifying silence. "What do you mean you stepped up to help him?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Kendra smiled, a tragic, naive smile that shattered my heart into a million pieces. "I proved to him that I am his equal in this marriage. Yesterday we went to a notary. Blake is restructuring his startup, and he needed to leverage some shared equity to keep the investors at bay. He explained the whole corporate strategy to me. It was highly technical, but basically he needed my legal authorization to manage our joint assets while he negotiates the merger. So I signed an investment power of attorney. He said it was just a temporary legal formality to help him secure a bridge loan and keep the company afloat until his big payout." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolutely lethal. An investment power of attorney. She said it with such casual confidence, completely oblivious to the legal suicide she had just committed. My mind raced back to the audit documents Bradley had sent me that morning. The fraudulent mortgage application, the $2 million private loan, the strict requirement for a digital signature and final verification tonight. Blake had not just forged her signature on the final closing documents, he had manipulated her into legally handing over the absolute power to sign them himself. He had convinced my daughter to hand him the keys to her own financial execution. And she did it with a proud smile, believing she was saving a visionary entrepreneur. "You signed a legal document granting him full control over the house?" I asked, forcing the words out through a tight jaw. "Yes," she replied, rolling her eyes in annoyance. "It is our house, Dad. We are a team. He needed my backing and I gave it to him. He is closing the deal tonight at the party. You see, he is not bankrupt. He is just transitioning his assets. You really should apologize to him tonight." A paralyzing chill ran straight down my spine. The final pieces of Blake Harrington's despicable puzzle snapped perfectly into place. He was not just taking out a desperate loan. He was using the power of attorney to legally bind Kendra to the $2 million debt, ensuring she would bear the entire legal and financial burden when he inevitably defaulted. Once the money hit that offshore account tonight, he would vanish, leaving my daughter to face the ruthless banks, the courts, and absolute ruin. He had weaponized her love to destroy her. I looked at Kendra, her eyes stubbornly refusing to see the reality sitting right in front of her. There was no time left to argue. Words would not save her now. Only raw, undeniable proof and a massive legal counterstrike could stop this impending tragedy. I stood up from the booth, leaving a $20 bill on the table. "I love you, Kendra," I said softly, "and I will always protect you, even when you hate me for it." Without waiting for her response, I walked out of the diner. I climbed into my truck, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring as I sped directly toward Bradley Cole's office. We had mere hours left to pull the plug on Blake's entire existence. The tires of my Ford truck screeched as I pulled into the private underground parking garage of Bradley Cole's downtown high-rise. I did not bother waiting for the receptionist to announce my arrival. I walked straight through the heavy glass doors of his executive suite. Bradley was already standing behind his massive mahogany desk, his face a mask of intense concentration. He had his legal team working on overdrive since our dawn phone call. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him exactly what Kendra had just confessed in the diner. "She signed an investment power of attorney yesterday," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room with absolute urgency. "Find it right now." Bradley's fingers flew across his keyboard, accessing the county's expedited digital registry. Within 3 minutes, a scanned copy of the document flashed onto his enormous wall monitor. We stood side by side in the dimly lit office, analyzing the dense legal jargon Blake had weaponized against my daughter. It was far worse than a standard power of attorney. Blake had intentionally utilized a highly aggressive, irrevocable commercial proxy. This specific document completely stripped Kendra of her right to contest any financial decision Blake made regarding their joint assets, including the $4 million estate. It was drafted with the precision of a seasoned con artist. Blake had hired a notoriously unscrupulous notary to fast-track the filing. We were looking at a loaded gun pointed directly at my daughter's future, and Blake had his finger resting firmly on the trigger. Bradley highlighted a specific subsection buried deep within the third page of the document. "Look at the disbursement routing instructions, Anton," he said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. He zoomed in on a string of alphanumeric codes at the bottom of the page. "Blake is not routing the $2 million loan into their domestic joint accounts to save his failing tech startup. He set up an auto-execution wire transfer directly attached to the closing signature." I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice as I read the routing details. The funds were slated to bypass the American banking system entirely. The destination was an offshore holding account located in the Cayman Islands, a completely untraceable, unreachable black hole in the financial world. The sheer cruelty of his plan laid bare right in front of my eyes. Blake was never trying to rescue his company or provide a stable future for my daughter. He was staging a massive financial heist. He planned to secure the $2 million using the house I bought, finalize the digital signature at the party tonight, and instantly funnel the cash offshore. Once the money cleared the international wire, he would simply vanish. He would hop on a first-class flight to Paris or somewhere equally far away, leaving Kendra holding the bag for a fraudulent $2 million mortgage she had absolutely no way of paying. She would lose the beautiful house she thought was hers. She would face aggressive litigation from ruthless private lenders. Her credit would be destroyed, and she would face absolute ruin while he lived like a king on stolen money. He had looked my daughter in the eyes, smiled his charming smile, and manipulated her into digging her own financial grave. He used her deep, genuine love for him as a blindfold while he robbed her blind. I felt a visceral, primal rage building in my chest. I had spent 40 years shielding Kendra from predators. I built an empire so she would never know the harsh bite of poverty I grew up with. And this arrogant, silver spoon fraudster thought he could stroll in, insult me to my face, and casually destroy my entire world before midnight. He vastly underestimated the man he was dealing with. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a foolish old man. He had no idea I owned the entire board. But the nightmare was not over. Bradley clicked out of the power of attorney and opened an encrypted file his forensic accountants had just pulled from the private lender's insecure server. "Anton, there is something else you need to see," Bradley said, his tone shifting from professional concern to outright alarm. "The private lender approving this $2 million bridge loan is not a traditional bank. They are a high-risk, aggressive firm. They knew Blake's credit was absolute garbage. They required a primary guarantor to underwrite the risk, someone with tangible assets to absorb the blow if Blake defaulted." Bradley pulled up the final page of the loan agreement. My heart stopped. Right there on the digital signature line for the primary financial guarantor was my name, Anton Pierce. Alongside it was a perfectly forged signature mimicking the exact stroke I used on the few documents Blake had seen me sign for Kendra's wedding. Blake had not just thrown Kendra to the wolves, he was actively dragging me down into the mud to serve as his ultimate scapegoat. He had snooped through my personal mail during his visits to my modest home, found my social security number, and listed me as the primary liable party for a $2 million fraudulent loan. His logic was twisted but terrifyingly clear. He assumed I was just a naive working-class black man with a paid-off house and a modest pension. He figured that when he skipped the country, the ruthless private lenders would come after my small brick house and my retirement funds. He was entirely willing to leave an elderly man destitute and homeless just to secure his own luxury escape. He thought I was an easy target, a quiet old man who would not know how to fight back against a mountain of complex legal debt. He intended to destroy my daughter's future and leave me bankrupt in the process, laughing all the way to his Cayman Island paradise. It was the ultimate act of supreme arrogance and racial condescension. He looked at me and saw nothing but a disposable asset. He truly believed his white-collar facade made him untouchable. Bradley looked at me, waiting for the explosive anger, waiting for me to order him to call the police and shut the entire thing down immediately. But I did not yell. My mind went absolutely still, executing a cold, calculated shift. "If we call the authorities now, Blake might panic and run before we can trap him," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "We are not going to stop the party. We are going to let him believe he has won. We are going to let him stand in front of his elite guests, believing he is the smartest man in the room." Bradley leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, dangerous smile forming on his face. He knew exactly what I was planning. "You want to execute the kill shot publicly," Bradley stated, closing the files on his monitor. I stood up from the heavy leather guest chair. I reached up and slowly adjusted the collar of my faded, worn-out work jacket, smoothing out the rough fabric. Blake Harrington looked me in the eye last night and told me I did not fit into his high society world. He told me I was an embarrassment to be hidden away in the kitchen, so I would not ruin his perfect aesthetic. He wanted me to be his servant. I nodded, a cold, unyielding resolve settling deep into my bones. Tonight I will give him exactly what he asked for. I will go to his lavish housewarming party. I will wear my apron. I will quietly walk among his elite investors and watch him finalize his own destruction. Tonight I will serve at his party. I arrived at the mansion just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns. The driveway was already choked with leased luxury sedans and flashy sports cars. I parked my old Ford truck out of sight down the street and walked up the grand stone pathway. I wore a simple, unbranded black suit. To the untrained eye, it looked like something off a discount rack. To me, it was armor. As soon as I stepped through the massive double doors, Blake intercepted me in the grand foyer. His face turned crimson with barely contained fury. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my sleeve, and pulled me behind a decorative marble pillar. "I thought I made myself perfectly clear last night, Anton," he hissed, his eyes darting around to make sure none of his guests were watching. "You do not belong here. You are an absolute eyesore to this aesthetic." I looked at him, my expression perfectly blank. "I am here to support my daughter," I replied evenly. Blake scoffed, adjusting his custom silk tie. "Kendra is busy entertaining people who actually matter. If you absolutely insist on staying and ruining my night, you are not going to stand around mingling." He snapped his fingers at a passing caterer, grabbed a silver tray loaded with champagne flutes, and shoved it roughly into my hands. "You want to be here so badly, then make yourself useful. Keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, and serve the drinks. Do not speak to my investors." I took the heavy silver tray without a single word of protest. I nodded slowly, adopting the submissive posture of a defeated old man, and walked past him into the sprawling living room. The sheer arrogance of Blake Harrington was a marvel to witness. He honestly believed he had just put me in my place. He had no idea he had just handed me the perfect camouflage. As a servant, you become entirely invisible to the rich. People look right through you. They talk openly, they drop their guards, and they reveal exactly who they are. I navigated the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits, offering champagne to people who snatched the glasses without so much as a glance in my direction. I observed the crowd with a cold, calculating eye. This was the elite society Blake was so desperate to join. But I knew the truth about rooms like this. I saw men with $50,000 watches who were secretly dodging margin calls. I saw women draped in diamonds bought on credit that would take 3 lifetimes to pay off. They were all performing, engaging in a pathetic, synchronized dance of financial illusion. They laughed too loud, bragged too much, and drank too fast. It was a circus of the insecure. Real wealth is silent. Real wealth is the ability to buy the entire room and everyone in it without ever raising your voice. I spotted Kendra near the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was wearing a stunning emerald dress, laughing nervously at a joke made by the wife of a mid-level venture capitalist. My heart ached for her. She was trying so hard to be the perfect hostess, completely unaware that the man she married was actively plotting to leave her drowning in $2 million of fraudulent debt before the night was over. I wanted to march over, grab her hand, and pull her out of this toxic mansion. But I held my ground. I had to let the play unfold. I needed Blake to step into the snare he had built for himself. I balanced the tray on my palm and seamlessly melted back into the background, slipping unnoticed down the wide, brightly lit hallway. I moved away from the loud music and the clinking of expensive crystal, making my way toward the secluded east wing of the house. Blake had designated this area as his private corporate sanctuary. The hallway was completely empty, the guests too preoccupied with networking and drinking at the open bar to notice an elderly black man carrying an empty silver tray. I reached the heavy oak doors of Blake's study. I turned the brass handle and slipped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The room was a testament to his bloated ego. The walls were lined with dark mahogany shelves filled with books I knew for a fact he had never read. A massive, ostentatious glass desk dominated the center of the room, positioned perfectly to overlook the sprawling backyard and the illuminated swimming pool. This was his throne room. This was the exact spot where he planned to sit down tonight, pull out his luxury fountain pen, and finalize the digital signature that would steal $2 million using my name and my daughter's future. I set the silver tray down on a side table. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a small, flat black device. Bradley Cole's security team had provided it just a few hours earlier. It was a military-grade voice-activated micro-recorder equipped with a real-time cellular transmitter. I walked over to the massive glass desk and knelt on the plush imported rug. I ran my hand along the underside of the desk, feeling the thick metal framing that supported the heavy glass top. I found a hidden recess right near where Blake's knees would rest. I peeled the adhesive backing off the device and pressed it firmly into the metal groove. It was completely undetectable unless you were actively dismantling the desk. I tapped the small activation button. A microscopic green light flashed once, signaling that Bradley's team was now listening to a live feed of the room. Every lie, every fraudulent transaction, and every single word spoken in this study would be recorded and transmitted directly to a secure server. I stood up, smoothed out the knees of my suit pants, and picked up the silver tray. I did a quick visual sweep of the room to ensure nothing looked out of place. The trap was set. The jaws were wide open. All I needed now was for the rat to take the bait. I quietly exited the study and walked back down the hallway, merging effortlessly back into the loud, chaotic energy of the housewarming party. As I returned to the grand foyer to collect another round of champagne, the atmosphere in the mansion suddenly shifted. The low hum of casual conversation completely dropped off, replaced by an electric, nervous tension. Blake, who had been loudly boasting to a group of minor tech developers near the bar, stopped mid-sentence. He hastily smoothed his hair, adjusted his suit jacket, and practically sprinted toward the front entrance. The heavy brass doorbell rang, a deep, resonating chime that cut through the music. The high-stakes players had finally arrived. The private lenders, the aggressive sharks Blake had desperately courted to secure his fraudulent bridge loan, were standing on the other side of that door. I stood near a marble column, a fresh tray of drinks in my hand, watching Blake open the double doors with a wide, sycophantic smile plastered across his face. He bowed his head, slightly eager to impress the men holding his financial lifeline. But as the towering figure stepped into the brightly lit foyer, my grip on the silver tray tightened. I knew exactly who these men were. The final act of this tragedy had just begun. Blake swung the heavy mahogany doors open, his face instantly transforming into a mask of pure, desperate sycophancy. 3 men stepped over the threshold, bringing with them a wave of cold, calculating energy that immediately altered the temperature of the room. Leading the pack was Gregory Thorne. Gregory was a man who commanded absolute authority without ever needing to raise his voice. He wore a charcoal, bespoke suit that made Blake's expensive designer outfit look like a cheap costume. Gregory's expression was unreadable, carved from granite as he stepped into the brightly lit foyer. Blake practically tripped over his own feet, rushing forward to greet them. "Mr. Thorne," Blake said, his voice pitching up half an octave in his frantic eagerness. "Welcome to our home. It is an absolute honor to host you and your associates tonight. We have been highly anticipating your arrival. Please come in. Let me take your coats. We have a private tasting menu prepared, and I have set up the main lounge exclusively for our presentation." Blake was sweating, a thin sheen of desperation gleaming on his forehead under the crystal chandelier. He was bowing and scraping, offering handshakes that were met with firm, unimpressed nods. Blake rambled on, throwing out corporate buzzwords, trying desperately to project the image of a peer, a fellow master of the universe. He was completely oblivious to how pathetic his groveling appeared. To the untrained eye, Blake was a gracious host, welcoming his most prestigious investors. To me, he looked like a pig happily marching himself directly into the slaughterhouse. I stood silently by the marble pillar, holding the heavy silver tray of champagne. Blake snapped his fingers in my direction, a sharp, disrespectful gesture meant to summon the help. He did not even look at me as he barked an order to bring the drinks forward. I walked toward the group with slow, deliberate, measured steps, keeping my eyes respectfully lowered. I offered the tray to the 2 junior associates first, then turned to Gregory. As Gregory reached out his large, impeccably manicured hand to take a crystal flute, our eyes met. It was a fraction of a second, a momentary collision of gazes that went entirely unnoticed by Blake, who was busy rambling about his smart home automation system. In that split second, Gregory Thorne did something extraordinary. He paused, lowered his chin, and offered me a microscopic, deeply reverent bow. It was a gesture of absolute respect, a silent acknowledgement from a loyal soldier to his commander. I kept my face perfectly blank, offering nothing but a polite server's nod in return, but a profound sense of satisfaction warmed my chest. Blake had no idea who he had invited into this house. He believed Gregory Thorne was the senior managing partner of Apex Capital Solutions, an aggressive high-risk private lending firm known for funding volatile tech startups. Blake thought he had found a ruthless shark willing to underwrite his $2 million fraudulent loan. What Blake did not know, what he could never have discovered because the corporate layering was flawless, was that Apex Capital Solutions was a shadow subsidiary entirely owned and operated by Pierce Global Logistics. I built Apex 15 years ago to handle hostile corporate takeovers, and Gregory Thorne was not just a managing partner. I hired Gregory straight out of graduate school. I mentored him. I molded him into the apex predator of the financial world. He was my right-hand man, my most trusted executive proxy. Blake thought he was tricking a foreign lender into bailing out his sinking ship. In reality, he had unknowingly walked straight into my corporate web. He was begging my own employee for a loan, offering my own house as collateral. I stepped back, holding the empty tray, marveling at the poetic justice of the moment. The trap was not just set. The prey was actively begging to be locked inside. Blake turned his attention back to me, his temporary facade of politeness instantly evaporating. He leaned in close, his expensive cologne doing nothing to mask the sour scent of his nervous sweat. "Take that tray and get out of my sight, Anton," he hissed under his breath, his teeth clenched in a vicious whisper. "Go to the catering kitchen in the back and stay there until the party is over. I do not want you wandering around while I deliver the pitch of my life. Do you understand me? Disappear." I gave him a blank, compliant stare, nodded once, and turned away. I did not go to the kitchen. Instead, I moved silently along the perimeter of the massive living room, blending perfectly into the shadows near the towering decorative indoor plants. I was a ghost in my own house, watching the executioner prepare his own gallows. Blake clapped his hands loudly, drawing the attention of the entire room. The ambient music faded out, and the custom lighting dimmed dramatically, focusing all illumination on a massive 80-inch digital display mounted on the far wall. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake announced, his voice projecting across the silent room with practiced theatricality. "Tonight is not just a housewarming. Tonight you are getting an exclusive ground floor look at the future of global supply chain management." He clicked a remote in his hand, and the screen roared to life with a slick, highly produced title graphic for his startup. Blake began to pace in front of the screen, gesturing wildly as he delivered a heavily rehearsed monologue. He threw around words like synergistic integration, machine learning, route optimization, and decentralized blockchain freight tracking. He spoke with the passionate cadence of a true visionary trying to dazzle the room of wealthy socialites and, more importantly, trying to secure Gregory's final approval for the $2 million transfer. He promised unprecedented profit margins. He promised a revolutionary software that would make traditional shipping conglomerates obsolete within 5 years. The crowd watched with rapt attention, sipping their expensive champagne, entirely captivated by his charismatic performance. From my vantage point in the shadows, I narrowed my eyes, focusing intensely on the glowing screen. Blake clicked to the next slide, bringing up a series of complex heat maps, projected quarterly revenue charts, and proprietary algorithm breakdowns. He proudly pointed to a specific graph detailing cross-country freight efficiency metrics. A sharp, icy shock jolted through my system. I stepped slightly out of the shadows, my eyes tracing the exact curve of the data lines displayed on the monitor. These were not fabricated numbers. This was not a mock-up of imaginary tech. I knew those heat maps. I knew those exact efficiency metrics. They were the highly classified internal third-quarter operational projections from North Star Freight, a mid-sized regional shipping carrier that Pierce Global Logistics had acquired in a hostile buyout just 8 months ago. Blake had not simply invented a fake company. He had somehow illegally bypassed corporate firewalls or purchased stolen corporate espionage data from my own subsidiary network to use as the foundational prop for his massive fraud. He was literally standing in my house, looking my employee in the eye and trying to secure a fraudulent loan by pitching my own stolen data back to me. The absolute audacity of his crime cemented his fate. There would be no mercy tonight. I backed away from the edge of the living room, letting the shadows swallow me as the crowd erupted into applause for Blake's stolen presentation. My blood was boiling, but I needed to maintain the facade of the invisible hired help. I picked up my silver tray and moved quietly down the corridor toward the east wing. I needed a moment to gather myself and collect the empty crystal glasses left behind by early arriving guests. The heavy oak doors of Blake's private study were slightly ajar. I slipped inside the thick carpet, silencing my footsteps. I gathered 2 discarded champagne flutes from a side table, preparing to head back to the catering kitchen. Suddenly, the sharp clack of high heels and the heavy thud of Blake's dress shoes echoed down the marble hallway. They were moving fast, their voices hushed but frantic. There was no time to walk out without causing a confrontation that would blow my cover entirely. I quickly stepped backward, pressing my back flat against the wall, and pulled the heavy floor-to-ceiling velvet drapes around me. I held my breath, becoming a mere shadow against the window frame. The oak door swung open forcefully, clicking shut with a heavy thud. Blake marched into the center of the room, completely unaware that he was not alone. He was not accompanied by Gregory or any of the other investors. Walking right behind him was the woman he had briefly introduced to the crowd earlier as his chief financial officer. She was a tall, striking woman in a tailored crimson dress carrying a leather portfolio that supposedly held the startup's financial projections. But the atmosphere between them was not professional in the slightest. The moment the heavy door latched, the professional distance between them completely evaporated. The chief financial officer dropped her leather portfolio onto the glass desk with a careless thud. Blake did not ask her for financial metrics or discuss the success of his presentation. Instead, he grabbed her by the waist, pulling her flush against his chest, and crashed his mouth down onto hers. They kissed with a desperate, hungry intensity that made my stomach churn. She tangled her hands in his carefully styled hair, letting out a soft, satisfied laugh as he pushed her back against the edge of the mahogany bookshelves. I stood perfectly rigid behind the velvet fabric, my hands clenched into tight fists at my sides, the silver tray resting silently on the floor by my boots. The sheer disgust washing over me was suffocating, but it was quickly overshadowed by a wave of profound, agonizing heartbreak. I was not thinking about the stolen corporate data or the fraudulent $2 million loan anymore. I was thinking about Kendra. My beautiful, fiercely loyal daughter was standing out there in the grand hall right now, wearing her emerald dress, smiling politely at strangers and defending this absolute monster to anyone who would listen. She had fought with me at the diner just hours ago, putting her own relationship with her father on the line to protect Blake's fragile ego. She truly believed she was building a life with a visionary partner. She thought she was the backbone of his success. The depth of his betrayal was staggering. He was not just robbing her blind financially. He was humiliating her on every possible human level. He was using the very house I purchased to shelter my child as a secluded playground for his sordid affair. He was making a mockery of her devotion while she proudly served his guests. I forced myself to breathe slowly, suppressing the overwhelming urge to step out from behind the curtain and break his jaw. Violence would only give him a victim narrative, a way to paint me as the aggressive, unhinged father-in-law he always claimed I was. I needed to destroy him systematically. I needed to strip away every layer of his fake existence so completely that he would never be able to manipulate another human being again. I kept my eyes locked on them through the narrow slit in the drapes, my mind cold and violently sharp, absorbing every vile detail of their encounter to fuel the reckoning that was about to come. Blake finally pulled away, panting slightly as he rested his forehead against hers. "You were brilliant out there," she whispered, trailing a manicured finger down the lapel of his suit. "Did the Apex guys buy it?" Blake let out a cruel, arrogant laugh that echoed through the quiet study. Gregory Thorne swallowed the whole pitch hook, line, and sinker. The guy is an absolute dinosaur. He saw those stolen efficiency metrics and practically salivated. "The authorization protocol is already initiated. They are processing the digital signature and moving to the final wire transfer right now." The woman smiled, her eyes gleaming with raw, unfiltered greed. "And the offshore routing? Is the Cayman account fully primed?" Blake nodded, moving to his glass desk and leaning over it confidently. He was speaking directly into the hidden microphone I had planted underneath it just an hour earlier. "Everything is set," he boasted, his voice loud and perfectly clear for the transmitter, catching every syllable. "The second the 2 million hits the international wire, it automatically bounces through 3 shell companies before landing in our Cayman account. It is completely untraceable. They will never be able to claw it back." "And your lovely wife?" the woman asked, her tone dripping with venomous mockery. Blake scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Kendra is completely clueless. She signed that irrevocable power of attorney yesterday, thinking she was saving my company. She practically handed me the shovel to dig her financial grave. I have the divorce papers already drafted and sitting in my briefcase right here. The moment I get the ping that the money has cleared offshore tonight, I am signing them and leaving them on the kitchen island. She can wake up tomorrow morning to a fraudulent mortgage, a $2 million debt, and a husband who no longer exists." The woman laughed again, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Our flight to Paris is at 6 in the morning, she murmured. "We need to be at the private terminal by 4. Are you sure that pathetic old man roaming around the party will not cause a scene before we leave?" Blake sneered at the mention of my name. "Anton is a broken, uneducated fool. He is out there serving drinks like a good little peasant. Let the private lenders tear him and Kendra to shreds when the debt comes due. We will be drinking vintage wine in France by the time they even realize they have been completely played." I remained absolutely motionless as they shared one last sickening kiss before adjusting their clothes and stepping back into their professional personas. Blake grabbed the leather portfolio, opened the heavy oak door, and ushered his mistress back out into the brightly lit hallway to rejoin the party. The door clicked shut, leaving the study in total silence. I waited 10 full seconds before stepping out from behind the velvet drapes. My blood was practically freezing in my veins, but my mind had never been clearer. Every single word of their vile escape plan had been captured in crystal-clear, high-definition audio by the transmitter under the desk. Bradley Cole and his legal team had it all. The affair, the premeditated theft, the flight to Paris, and the blatant admission of fraud were now permanently recorded. I reached into my pocket as my phone suddenly vibrated with 3 short, sharp buzzes. I pulled it out and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a highly secure automated alert from Bradley's banking division. The text was brief and undeniable. The $2 million wire transfer order from Apex Capital Solutions has been officially activated by Blake Harrington. The funds are currently holding in the domestic verification escrow pending final clearance. The countdown had reached 0. He had pulled the trigger. Now it was my turn to fire back. I pocketed my phone and stepped out of the study, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. The hallway was still deserted, but the muted roar of the party echoed from the grand living room. I needed to find Kendra immediately. I navigated the sea of oblivious wealthy guests, my eyes scanning the room until I spotted her emerald dress. She was standing near the open French doors leading to the massive wraparound balcony, politely laughing at a joke made by a junior executive. I did not care about breaking character anymore. I walked straight up to her, my face a mask of absolute authority. "Excuse us," I said to the executive, my voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. Before Kendra could object or complain about my tone, I clamped my hand firmly around her upper arm. I did not squeeze hard enough to hurt her, but my grip was unyielding. "Dad, what are you doing?" she hissed under her breath, trying to pull away without drawing attention from the surrounding crowd. "You are embarrassing me again." I ignored her protests entirely. I guided her swiftly through the French doors and steered her toward the farthest, darkest corner of the expansive stone balcony, completely isolated from the music and the laughter inside. The cool night air whipped around us, carrying the scent of expensive catering and impending doom. She yanked her arm free, her eyes blazing with humiliated fury. "Have you completely lost your mind?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "Blake is right inside finalizing the biggest deal of his life, and you are out here treating me like a child." I did not offer a single word of explanation. Explanations could be argued with, excuses could be made. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the secure audio file Bradley had forwarded from the hidden transmitter just minutes ago. I turned the volume all the way up, held the screen up so the harsh white light illuminated my face, and pressed play. The pristine, high-definition audio cut through the chill of the night air like a physical blade. First came the unmistakable, sickening sound of a heavy kiss, followed by the chief financial officer's breathy laugh. Then Blake's voice rang out, arrogant and crystal clear. "Kendra is completely clueless. She signed that irrevocable power of attorney yesterday, thinking she was saving my company. She practically handed me the shovel to dig her financial grave. I have the divorce papers already drafted and sitting in my briefcase right here. The moment I get the ping that the money has cleared offshore tonight, I am signing them and leaving them on the kitchen island. She can wake up tomorrow morning to a fraudulent mortgage, a $2 million debt, and a husband who no longer exists." The recording ended, leaving a deafening, crushing silence in its wake. I watched my daughter's face closely. The angry, defensive posture she had held just seconds ago vanished completely, replaced by a haunting, absolute stillness. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll about to shatter into a million pieces. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror as the reality of the words washed over her. She stared at the phone in my hand, her mouth opening and closing as if she were desperately trying to draw oxygen into her collapsing lungs. She shook her head side to side, a slow, mechanical movement of total denial. "No," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "No, that is a lie. That is a fake. You made that up." I looked at her with a steady, unbreakable gaze. "You know his voice, Kendra," I said quietly. "You know exactly who that is. And you know exactly what you signed yesterday." The undeniable truth finally breached her defenses. Her knees buckled slightly and she grabbed the cold stone railing of the balcony to keep from collapsing onto the terrace. A ragged, agonizing gasp tore from her throat. The illusion of her perfect marriage, the visionary husband she had fiercely defended against me just hours ago, was brutally ripped away, exposing the ugly predatory reality underneath. She was completely broken. A violent, chaotic energy suddenly seized her. The shock rapidly mutated into a blinding, hysterical rage. "I am going to kill him," she sobbed, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "I am going to tear him apart right in front of everyone." She spun around her emerald dress, catching the wind as she lunged toward the French doors leading back into the brightly lit mansion. She was completely unhinged, ready to storm into the living room, scream at the top of her lungs, and physically attack the man who was currently laughing with his mistress and her supposed investors. But I anticipated her reaction. Before she could take 3 steps, I stepped squarely into her path. I grabbed her by both shoulders, my hands locking her in place with the immovable strength of a man who had spent 40 years moving freight. "Let me go!" she screamed, thrashing against my grip, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Let me go right now. I have to stop him. He is stealing everything." I shook her hard just once, snapping her out of her blind panic. "Listen to me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute obedience. "Do not scream. Do not make a scene. If you walk in there and throw a tantrum, he will spin it to his advantage. He will call you a hysterical, crazy woman. He will have security escort you out of your own house, and he will hit the final button on that wire transfer while you are crying on the front lawn. Do you understand me?" She stopped, thrashing her chest, heaving with violent sobs, looking up at me with wild, terrified eyes. "But he is taking the house," she choked out, her voice cracking with despair. "He is leaving me with $2 million in debt. I am ruined, Dad. I am completely ruined." I tightened my grip on her shoulders, forcing her to focus entirely on my eyes. I needed her to see the absolute certainty burning within them. "Tears will not save your money, Kendra." I said, my tone as cold and hard as steel. "Crying will not cancel a fraudulent contract. Hysteria will not put a thief behind bars. Strategy will. I brought you out here to show you the truth, not to let you ruin the trap I have spent all day setting. Wipe your face. Take a deep breath. Stop acting like the victim he expects you to be." She stared at me, trembling, the cold reality of my words slowly penetrating her panic. "Now," I said, releasing her shoulders and stepping back. "Let me do my job." Kendra stood frozen against the stone railing, her breath steadying as the final remnants of her panic began to subside. She looked at me, but she was no longer looking at the quiet, accommodating father who wore faded flannel shirts and drove an old, beat-up truck. Her eyes widened with a sudden profound realization. The absolute commanding authority in my voice, the military precision of my actions, and the fact that I possessed a high-grade audio recording of her husband's private conversation fundamentally shifted her perception. She saw for the very first time in her life the ruthless corporate titan I had kept hidden from her. A man who did not just survive in the world, but actively controlled it. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice laced with awe and a sudden, undeniable sense of safety. "I am the man who is going to burn his entire life to the ground," I replied evenly. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the encrypted messaging application, and typed a single decisive directive to Bradley Cole. "Freeze everything." I hit send, locking the gates of my corporate empire shut. The execution had begun. I watched from the shadows of the terrace as the invisible gears of my empire began to grind Blake Harrington into absolute dust. Inside the lavishly decorated living room, the party was reaching its absolute peak. The music pulsed with a steady rhythmic bass, and the elite guests mingled with crystal glasses in hand, completely oblivious to the financial execution taking place behind the scenes. Blake emerged from the crowd looking like a conquering king. He strutted over to the grand marble bar where the head manager of the premier catering company was waiting with a sleek digital payment terminal. It was time to settle the exorbitant bill for the night of extravagant charades. Blake flashed his trademark, arrogant smile, displaying a look of pure, unadulterated smugness. He casually reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a heavy metal black credit card, and tossed it onto the marble counter with a dramatic clatter. The catering manager offered a polite bow of his head, picked up the card, and inserted it into the terminal. Blake turned his back to the bar, leaning against the marble edge and winking at a passing junior executive. He was riding the high of his impending $2 million theft. But the terminal emitted a sharp, piercing beep. The manager frowned, pulling the card out and wiping the chip on his sleeve before reinserting it. The terminal beeped again. The manager cleared his throat and stated politely that the transaction had been declined. Blake scoffed, waving his hand dismissively as if the machine itself was simply too inferior to process his vast wealth. He sharply ordered the manager to run the card again, claiming it was just a security feature for high-volume purchases. The catering manager complied, pressing the buttons with practiced efficiency and sliding the heavy metal card back into the slot. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds before emitting that exact same sharp, piercing beep. The bold red letters flashed across the small digital screen, confirming the decline. Blake lost his arrogant smile entirely, and a sudden rigid tension locked his jaw. A wealthy socialite standing nearby paused her conversation and cast a curious, judging glance toward the bar. In Blake's world of superficial elites, a declined card was the ultimate social sin. It was the scent of blood in the water. He quickly snatched the black card from the manager with jerky and uncoordinated movements. He snapped that the machine was obviously malfunctioning, his voice rising a fraction of an octave as a bead of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He ripped his designer wallet open and pulled out a platinum credit card, slapping it onto the marble surface. The manager picked it up and ran it through the terminal. The machine beeped instantly. Declined. Blake drained of color. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as genuine panic began to override his carefully constructed confidence. He pulled out a third card linking directly to his Holotech startup corporate account. He shoved it at the manager, his hands visibly trembling. He desperately pleaded with the man to try this one and run it manually. The manager tapped the screen and processed the third card. The result was exactly the same. Declined. The manager read the screen aloud, telling Blake to please contact his financial institution. The manager then stated with thinly veiled pity that he would need an alternative form of payment because the catering company had strict policies regarding event settlements. Blake stood frozen, staring at the 3 pieces of useless plastic resting on the marble bar. His confident facade cracked, breaking apart into jagged pieces right in front of the guests. The bespoke suit suddenly looked suffocating. He violently loosened his silk tie, gasping for air as the crushing reality of his situation began to set in. He grabbed the cards, shoved them carelessly into his pocket, and backed away from the bar. He choked out a request for 5 minutes, avoiding eye contact with everyone around him. He claimed he just needed to call his private concierge because his bank was overzealous with fraud protection. He turned and practically bolted away from the crowded living room, retreating frantically toward the quiet, deserted corridor of the West Wing. I tracked his movement from the perimeter, stepping quietly inside the house to keep him in my line of sight. He paced frantically back and forth in the empty hallway, pulling his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. He dialed the exclusive Premier client service number for his offshore banking institution. He fully expected to hear the soothing, deferential voice of his assigned wealth concierge rushing to apologize for the inconvenience. He had absolutely no idea that the number he was dialing had been intercepted and completely rerouted by Bradley Cole and his cybersecurity division. The call went directly into a closed-loop system controlled entirely by my corporate team. A voice answered on the second ring. It was not a sycophantic concierge. It was the cold, detached, and heavily modulated voice of a compliance officer operating under my strict directives. The voice flatly announced Premier Services. Blake gripped the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. He barked his name, trying to project an authority he no longer possessed. He demanded to know why his accounts were frozen and why every single card was declining at his own event. He aggressively ordered the representative to lift the security hold immediately and confirm the status of the $2 million offshore wire transfer he had authorized an hour ago. There was a deliberate, agonizing pause on the other end of the line, a silence designed to stretch his nerves to their absolute breaking point. The cold voice finally responded, addressing him formally. The representative stated that his cards had not been temporarily suspended for routine security. All associated accounts, personal and corporate, had been permanently frozen. Furthermore, the representative revealed that the $2 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands had been intercepted and officially canceled by the domestic clearinghouse. Blake stopped pacing. His entire body locked up as if he had been struck by a physical blow. He gasped, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wheeze as he demanded to know what the representative meant by canceled. He shouted that they could not do that because he had the proper authorization and the signed power of attorney. He ordered them to release the funds right now, screaming that he was not asking but commanding them. The voice on the phone remained entirely unmoved and completely indifferent to his escalating hysteria. The representative stated with robotic precision that the authorization documents he provided had been flagged by their internal security division. The voice coldly informed him that his accounts were currently under an active federal investigation for wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. The representative concluded by stating that Blake no longer had access to any financial services through their institution and warned him not to attempt to access the accounts again. The line went dead with a sharp, definitive click. Blake pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the darkened screen with a look of absolute, unadulterated terror. The walls of his meticulously crafted fake life were rapidly closing in, crushing the breath right out of his lungs. He was completely broke, exposed, and now officially under investigation for massive financial fraud. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had zero access to his escape funds. The lavish flight to Paris was gone. The offshore millions were gone. The pristine future he had plotted with his mistress had just vanished into thin air. The only thread he had left was Kendra. Her name was on the foundational trust documents. He desperately reasoned that if he could just find her and force her to call the fraud department as the primary account holder, she could verbally override the security freeze using her maiden name and social security credentials. He shoved the dead phone into his pocket and sprinted back toward the main party. He burst into the grand living room looking like a hunted animal. His hair was disheveled, his face was dripping with sweat, and his eyes darted wildly across the crowded room, frantically searching the sea of elegant guests for her emerald dress. He needed his wife to fix his mess. He needed his victim to make one last phone call to save his life. Blake spotted the vibrant emerald green fabric of Kendra's dress near the arched entryway of the formal dining room. He did not care who was watching anymore. The carefully crafted facade of the gracious host vanished. He lunged forward, grabbing her by the wrist with a grip so tight it made her wince in pain. He pulled her aggressively away from a group of startled tech executives, dragging her forcefully down the long marble corridor and shoving her through the heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The doors flapped shut immediately, cutting off the upbeat music and the loud chatter of the party, plunging them into the stark, bright fluorescent light of the stainless steel room. Blake released her wrist, his chest heaving as he paced the tiled floor like a caged predator. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "Get your phone out right now," he ordered, his voice echoing sharply against the metal prep tables. "The bank put a ridiculous security freeze on my accounts because of a massive incoming wire transfer. I need you to call the fraud department immediately. They need your voice authorization and your maiden name to bypass the domestic block. Do it now, Kendra. The caterers are threatening to cut off the bar." Kendra rubbed her bruised wrist, her posture completely transforming. Just an hour ago, she would have panicked, eager to fix any problem for the husband she adored. But now, standing under the harsh kitchen lights, she was a pillar of absolute ice. She looked at his sweating, desperate face with a chilling detachment. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "I cannot do that, Blake," she said, her voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "The accounts are locked because they are under a federal fraud investigation. I will not interfere with a criminal inquiry." Blake stopped pacing, his eyes widening in pure shock. For a second he looked like he had been struck by a physical blow. How did she know that? But the shock rapidly dissolved into a vicious, explosive rage. The charming, visionary tech CEO completely disintegrated, revealing the feral, cornered animal hiding underneath. He lunged toward her, slamming his palms flat on the stainless steel counter right behind her back, trapping her against the cold metal. "You stupid, useless little girl," he spat, the venom in his voice dripping with pure malice. "You have absolutely no idea how high finance works. You understand nothing about corporate liquidity. I am building an empire, and you are going to stand there and let a bank glitch ruin the most important night of my career." He leaned his face inches from hers, his features contorted with ugly, unrestrained contempt. "I built this life for you. I plucked you out of your pathetic, mediocre existence. Without me, you are nothing. You are just a working class, nobody exactly like your pathetic father. Do you really think I married you because you were my equal? I married you because you were a convenient, naive mark with a clean background and excellent credit. You were a stepping stone. You were supposed to stand there, look pretty, and sign the papers when I told you to sign them. You owe me everything." Kendra did not flinch. A single tear betrayed her slipping down her cheek, but she did not break his gaze. My intervention on the balcony had fortified her spine. She saw Blake not as a husband, but as a desperate parasite losing its host. I stood completely still in the dark, recessed pantry at the far end of the catering kitchen. I gripped a folded white kitchen towel in my hand, my muscles coiled like tight springs. I watched this pathetic excuse for a man hurl verbal abuse at my only child. Every paternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to step out of the shadows, grab him by the throat, and throw him through the nearest glass window. But I held my ground. I let him dig his grave deeper. I needed Kendra to hear every single vile word. I needed her to see the absolute monster he truly was, so she would never doubt the destruction I was about to rain down upon his head. Blake spun away from her, running his hands violently through his perfectly styled hair, leaving it a chaotic mess. He paced the length of the kitchen, cursing under his breath, desperately searching for a lifeline. His eyes darted around the room and suddenly landed on the dark pantry doorway. He saw me step forward into the fluorescent light, still holding the white catering towel, dressed in my simple, unbranded black suit. His eyes locked onto me, and the panic in his brain instantly converted into a tyrannical, desperate rage. He realized Kendra was a dead end. She was not going to make the call. But he needed cash right this second to keep the caterers quiet and buy himself enough time to flee. He marched straight across the kitchen floor, closing the distance between us until he was standing chest to chest with me. He jabbed a rigid, aggressive finger directly into my sternum. "You," Blake snarled, his breath ragged and sour. "You want to be useful for once in your miserable, worthless life. You are going to fix this. You are going to call one of those predatory cash lenders right now. You own that pathetic, run-down brick shack of yours free and clear, do you not? You are going to take out an emergency reverse mortgage. I do not care what the interest rate is. I do not care if it takes every last cent of equity you have. You are going to wire $50,000 into my operating account right this very second." He stepped closer, attempting to physically intimidate me, trying to use his height and his tailored suit to assert dominance over a man he viewed as an uneducated servant. He leaned down, his voice dropping into a vicious, guttural threat. "If you refuse me, Anton, I will destroy your daughter. I own this estate. I hold all the cards. If I do not get that money in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to march out there, humiliate Kendra in front of every single investor, and throw you both out onto the street tonight. I will toss her out the front door with nothing but the clothes on her back. You can both go rot in your little poverty trap of a neighborhood, and I will make sure she spends the rest of her life paying for my massive debts. Call the broker. Old man, pick up your phone and do it right now." The heavy swinging doors of the kitchen remained perfectly still. The distant, muffled bass of the party music pulsed through the walls, entirely disconnected from the raw, ugly extortion happening in the sterile kitchen. I looked down at the finger pressed hard against my chest. I looked up into Blake Harrington's red, sweating, panic-stricken face. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for, the absolute pinnacle of his delusion. He truly believed he held the power of life and death over my family. He believed he was a titan casting judgment on a peasant. I did not yell back. I did not swat his hand away or raise my voice in defense. I felt a profound, almost terrifying sense of calm wash over my entire body. The anger that had been simmering inside me for 3 long years crystallized into pure, unbreakable ice. I slowly reached up, took the white catering towel from my shoulder, and wiped my hands with deliberate, agonizingly slow precision. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the smile of an executioner who had just been handed a signed, undeniable death warrant. I let the absolute silence of the catering kitchen stretch for another agonizing second. Blake's face was flushed with frantic, desperate anger, his finger still aggressively pointed at my chest. He was breathing heavily, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to pull out my phone and beg a predatory lender to drain my life savings just to save him. Instead, I carefully finished wiping my hands with the folded white catering towel. I tossed the damp cloth onto the nearest stainless steel prep table with a sharp, dismissive slap. I reached behind my back and gripped the tight knot of the black catering apron he had forced me to wear all evening. I pulled the strings free with one swift, deliberate motion. I slipped the apron over my head, balling the heavy fabric up in my calloused hands. Blake blinked, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion as he watched me. Before he could formulate another vile insult, I shoved the balled-up apron directly into his chest. I hit him with enough sudden force that he stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the pristine tiled floor. He instinctively caught the fabric, clutching it against his ruined designer suit, his mouth hanging open in pure shock. I did not flinch. I did not look away. The subservient, quiet old man he had berated and humiliated for the past 3 years completely evaporated. I straightened my shoulders, rolling my neck slightly as the oppressive weight of playing the obedient inferior father-in-law finally lifted from my back. The physical transformation was immediate and undeniable. For 36 months I had consciously rounded my shoulders, kept my gaze lowered, and softened my voice to make this fragile, insecure boy feel like a giant. I had endured his microaggressions, his blatant racism, and his insufferable arrogance simply to protect Kendra's happiness. But looking at my daughter now standing perfectly still by the industrial refrigerator with her eyes finally open to his monstrous reality, I knew the charade was officially over. I pulled myself up to my full height, letting the rigid, unyielding posture of a man who had dominated global boardrooms take absolute control. The cheap, unbranded black suit I wore suddenly looked like tailored armor. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavy and dense with a terrifying new authority. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. I did not step into his personal space like a brawler looking for a fight. I stepped into his space like an apex predator claiming its rightful territory. Blake shrank back, his shoulders practically hitting the metal cabinets behind him. His eyes darted nervously between my face and Kendra, searching for an explanation for the sudden, terrifying shift in my demeanor. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice dropping an octave into a cold, resonant baritone that echoed with absolute finality. "You told me last night that I do not fit into your elite aesthetic." "Blake," I said, pronouncing each word with lethal precision. "You told me to stay in the guest house or hide in the kitchen because I am an embarrassment to your high society friends." I held his panicked gaze, refusing to let him look away. "You were absolutely right. I do not fit in here. But it is not because I am a poor, uneducated old man. It is because I am not a guest in this house, and I am certainly not your servant." I took another half step forward, my voice cutting through his crumbling ego like a diamond-tipped drill. "I do not fit in here because I own it. I own the very floor you are standing on." A tense, suffocating silence gripped the kitchen for a fleeting moment before Blake shattered it with a harsh, barking laugh. It was a frantic, unhinged sound dripping with sheer desperation. He threw the crumpled black apron onto the floor and shook his head, a wild, manic gleam igniting in his eyes. "You have completely lost your mind, old man." Blake sneered, his voice cracking slightly as he desperately tried to regain the upper hand. "You are having a psychotic break. You own this estate. You do not even own a car made in this century. You live in a brick shack and you smell like cheap coffee and motor oil." He looked wildly at Kendra, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "Your father has officially gone insane. Call security and have him dragged out of here before he completely ruins my night." I did not bother offering a single word of rebuttal. Arguments are for men who still have something to prove. Kings do not argue with court jesters. I simply turned my back on his pathetic, sputtering meltdown. I looked at Kendra, offering her a single reassuring nod. She did not say a word, but her posture straightened, a fierce, newly awakened strength shining in her tear-stained eyes. She knew exactly what I was about to do. I pushed past the heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen and walked out into the brightly lit marble corridor. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured, undeniable stride of a man heading directly to a throne he had left vacant for far too long. The thumping bass of the party music grew louder with every step. I rounded the corner and stepped out into the grand living room. The space was still packed with the city's financial elite, venture capitalists, socialites, and tech executives, all mingling and laughing, holding their crystal champagne flutes. They were completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was about to crack wide open. I bypassed the catering staff, ignored the confused glances of the event planners, and marched straight down the center of the room. The crowd parted naturally, instinctively stepping aside, as the raw, gravitational pull of my authority cleared a path through the glittering sea of designer dresses and custom tuxedos. I was heading directly for the raised presentation stage Blake had set up in front of the massive digital monitor. I stepped up onto the raised wooden platform, the hollow thud of my boots echoing faintly underneath the music. I walked directly to the sleek acrylic speaking podium that Blake had used just an hour earlier to deliver his fraudulent stolen pitch. I gripped the edges of the podium with both hands and leaned over the microphone. The sheer audacity of an elderly black man dressed in a plain, unbranded suit taking the center stage immediately sent a ripple of confusion through the entire room. Dozens of conversations abruptly halted. Heads turned. Crystal glasses were lowered. Within seconds, the attention of every single high-profile investor, including Gregory Thorne and his associates, was locked entirely on me. Just as I reached out to tap the microphone, the heavy double doors at the far end of the hall burst open. Blake came sprinting out of the corridor, his face completely drained of color, his silk tie flying wildly over his shoulder. He saw me standing at his podium, and a look of absolute primal horror seized his features. He lunged into the crowd, shoving wealthy guests aside, desperately sprinting toward the stage to rip the microphone away from my hands before I could speak. I gripped the sleek acrylic edges of the podium and leaned toward the microphone. Blake was sprinting down the center aisle, shoving wealthy guests aside with reckless desperation, his eyes wide with the primal terror of a man watching his entire fraudulent existence collapse. He opened his mouth to scream, raising his hand to rip the microphone away from me. He never made it to the stage. Gregory Thorne, who had been standing in the front row impeccably composed, did not even look at Blake. He simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers once. The sound was sharp and commanding. Instantly, two massive men in tailored dark suits materialized from the surrounding crowd. They were not party security. They were my personal executive protection detail. They intercepted Blake mid-sprint, hooking his arms with brutal efficiency and slamming him to a complete halt just 5 feet from the edge of the platform. Blake thrashed wildly, kicking his polished leather shoes against the marble floor, his face red with frantic rage. He screamed at them to let him go, shouting that I was a crazy, delusional old man who was ruining his corporate event. Gregory ignored him entirely. He stepped forward, buttoned his charcoal suit jacket, and turned to face me. Right in front of the city's financial elite, the ruthless managing partner of Apex Capital Solutions lowered his chin and offered me a deep, highly formal bow of absolute submission. He then stepped aside silently, demanding that the entire room pay attention to his commanding officer. The ballroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. The powerful investor had just bowed to the catering staff. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, rhythmic thumps echoed through the sprawling mansion, sealing the room in total quiet. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting with a deep, unyielding resonance that commanded absolute authority. I apologize for interrupting the scheduled entertainment, but I felt it was time the host of this party formally introduced himself. I scanned the sea of confused, shocked faces. The tech executives, the venture capitalists, the high society socialites all stared at me in bewildered silence. Many of you do not recognize my face, and that is entirely by design. I prefer to operate in the shadows. But I guarantee every single one of you in the financial sector knows my name, and you certainly know my company's. I stood up to my full height, projecting the dominant, untouchable aura of a titan. My name is Anton Pierce. I am the founder, majority shareholder, and acting chairman of Pierce Global Logistics. A collective audible gasp rippled through the grand living room. The name dropped like a live grenade. Murmurs erupted instantly as the executives in the crowd exchanged wide-eyed, horrified glances. They knew Pierce Global Logistics was a multi-hundred-million-dollar international empire. I raised my hand, silencing the whispers immediately. "But that is not the only thing I own," I continued, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I am also the sole beneficiary and absolute controller of the blind trust that purchased this $4 million estate. I own the imported marble floors you are standing on. I own the walls surrounding you. I own the very stage I am speaking from." I shifted my gaze down to Blake, who was still pinned between my security guards. And as for the massive high-risk $2 million bridge loan our visionary host was trying to secure tonight, I gestured smoothly toward Gregory Thorne. Apex Capital Solutions is not an independent private lender. It is a shadow subsidiary entirely owned and operated by my corporate network. He was begging my own employee for a loan and attempting to use my own house as collateral. Blake stopped struggling. The remaining blood drained completely from his face, turning his skin the color of dirty ash. He stood frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open, a hollow, trembling ghost trapped in an expensive suit. His eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for a punchline, searching for a way out of the nightmare, but he found nothing except the cold, judging stares of the elite crowd he had tried so desperately to impress. I looked directly down at him, my expression devoid of any mercy. For 3 years I have worn faded flannel shirts and scuffed work boots around you, Blake. I drove a 20-year-old rusted truck and sat quietly at your dinner table while you threw condescending insults in my direction. I let you treat me like an uneducated peasant. I let you mock my background. I let you direct your thinly veiled racist microaggressions at me while you puffed out your chest and pretended to be a master of the universe. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. I kept my voice perfectly measured, ensuring every word landed with devastating precision. When my daughter married you, I needed to know the true measure of the man holding her heart. Money attracts parasites, and I needed to know if you loved Kendra or if you simply loved the lifestyle you believed she could provide. I wanted to see how you behaved when you thought you held all the power. I wanted to see what kind of man you were to someone you believed was beneath you. I leaned closer to the microphone. You failed the test spectacularly. Just an hour ago, you stopped me in the foyer and told me I was an embarrassment to your aesthetic. You handed me a tray and ordered me to serve drinks so I would not ruin your image. 10 minutes ago in the catering kitchen, you pinned my daughter against a metal counter, called her a useless nobody, and demanded I mortgage my brick shack to save you from your own pathetic failures. You thought you were dealing with a weak, ignorant old man. You thought your white-collar facade made you untouchable. I straightened up, letting my gaze sweep across the captivated audience. You stood on this very stage tonight and boasted about your genius. You paraded around as a visionary entrepreneur selling this room a magnificent fantasy wrapped in custom silk and stolen corporate data. You demanded respect and admiration from everyone here. I looked toward the back of the grand hall. Standing near the audio-visual control booth was Bradley Cole holding a secure tablet connected directly to the mansion's main projection system. I gave him a sharp, definitive nod. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I announced, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable finality. Let us see what this outstanding entrepreneur really has. The massive 80-inch digital monitor behind me flickered, completely cutting off the slick, stolen title graphic of Blake Harrington's non-existent tech startup. Bradley Cole tapped a single key on his secured tablet at the back of the room, executing the override sequence we had planned to absolute perfection. The screen roared back to life, flooding the grand living room with a harsh, glaring white light. In place of the vibrant heat maps and proprietary algorithms, the display now showcased a chaotic, deeply embarrassing mosaic of Blake's actual financial reality. High-resolution scans of his personal and corporate bank statements dominated the wall, every single one of them highlighted with bright, undeniable red ink indicating severe overdrafts. I stepped to the side of the podium, allowing the elite crowd an unobstructed view of the carnage. To the left of the screen, Bradley projected the fraudulent $2 million loan application Blake had submitted to Apex Capital Solutions. The document was magnified, focusing entirely on the primary guarantor section. Right there in massive digital print was my forged signature. To the right of the screen, a cascading list of aggressive default notices from subprime, high-interest private lenders scrolled continuously. It detailed hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid debts, exorbitant late fees, and final warnings of asset seizure. The documents laid bare the pathetic truth of his daily existence. Every tailored silk suit he wore, every luxury sports car parked in the driveway, and every bottle of premium champagne flowing through this party was financed by a suffocating mountain of fraudulent debt. He was entirely bankrupt, operating on a negative net worth so severe it was mathematically impossible for him to ever recover legally. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly merciless. This was a room filled with the city's most ruthless venture capitalists, seasoned investment bankers, and veteran tech executives. These were men and women who dissected complex balance sheets for a living. They did not need me to explain the numbers flashing on the screen. They read the tragic story of Blake's failure in a matter of seconds. A profound, icy wave of contempt swept through the grand living room. The polite, intrigued expressions they had worn during his presentation vanished, replaced by sneers of visceral disgust. I watched a prominent hedge fund manager in the front row lower his crystal flute, shaking his head with a harsh, mocking scoff. Two tech developers who had been eagerly hanging onto Blake's every word just moments ago turned their backs to the stage in sheer embarrassment. The collective murmurs of the elite crowd swelled into a loud, undeniable hum of judgment. In their world, aggressive business tactics were respected, but being a broke, desperate con artist attempting to steal from the very people he invited into his home was the ultimate, unforgivable sin. Several executives immediately pulled out their smartphones, undoubtedly sending rapid-fire messages to their networks to permanently blacklist Blake Harrington from every boardroom in the country. He was instantly radioactive. Gregory Thorne stood perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest, looking at the struggling man held by my security detail with an expression of absolute withering pity. Blake had tried to swim with apex predators wearing a suit made of chum. The illusion of the visionary CEO was completely eradicated. The numbers proved he had zero revenue, zero proprietary technology, and zero actual capital. He was exposed as a parasitic fraud who had lied his way into a lifestyle he could never afford. His arrogant, superior facade crumbled under the harsh, analytical glare of the very society he had sacrificed his own humanity to join. But financial ruin was simply not enough. Blake had not just tried to steal my money. He had intentionally humiliated my daughter and planned to destroy her life without a single ounce of remorse. The punishment needed to match the profound depth of his cruelty. I looked across the room, finding Kendra standing tall near the arched entryway. She was not crying. She was watching the screen with the icy, unyielding strength of a true Pierce. I nodded to Bradley once more. The massive display shifted again. The humiliating financial documents vanished, replaced by a crystal-clear, high-definition photograph. A collective gasp echoed through the mansion. It was the image captured by my hidden operative just an hour ago. The picture showed Blake inside the mahogany study, pressed hard against the bookshelves, deeply engaged in a passionate, desperate kiss with the tall woman in the crimson dress, the woman he had publicly introduced as his chief financial officer. The visual evidence of his infidelity hit the room like a physical shockwave, but the final nail in the coffin was yet to come. The state-of-the-art surround sound system wired throughout the entire $4 million estate suddenly crackled to life. The pristine audio recording from the hidden microphone under his glass desk boomed from every speaker. The voice of his mistress echoed, first dripping with venomous greed, asking about the offshore routing and calling me a wretched old woman. Then Blake's own arrogant, booming voice filled the silent room. Kendra is completely clueless, the recording blared, ensuring every single guest heard his ultimate betrayal. She signed that irrevocable power of attorney yesterday thinking she was saving my company. She practically handed me the shovel to dig her financial grave. I have the divorce papers already drafted and sitting in my briefcase right here. The moment I get the ping that the money has cleared offshore tonight, I am signing them and leaving them on the kitchen island. She can wake up tomorrow morning to a fraudulent mortgage, a $2 million debt, and a husband who no longer exists. The recording played on detailing his cowardly flight to Paris and his vile racist insults regarding my background. Blake, still pinned between my two massive security guards, stopped struggling entirely. His knees gave out, his body going completely limp as he was forced to stand there and listen to his own vile, unforgivable words broadcast to the entire world. The absolute terror in his eyes was undeniable. Near the back of the living room, standing frozen near the marble bar, the woman in the tailored crimson dress realized she was entirely exposed. The eyes of the surrounding guests snapped toward her, recognizing her immediately from the massive photograph dominating the wall. The elite crowd did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. They parted around her, instantly stepping back as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. Panic seized her features. She raised her leather portfolio to cover her face, her confident stride degrading into a frantic, desperate stumble backward. She pushed blindly through the throng of judgmental whispers, practically sprinting toward the front double doors to escape the humiliating spotlight, abandoning Blake without a second thought. The murmurs in the room escalated into a deafening roar of absolute scandal. In exactly 5 minutes, I had systematically dismantled every single pillar supporting Blake Harrington's miserable existence. I had annihilated his business, exposed his mountain of fraudulent debt, destroyed his marriage, and permanently incinerated his professional reputation. His carefully curated honor was pulverized into dust in front of the exact people he worshipped. He was no longer a visionary tech founder or a wealthy socialite. He was a disgraced, bankrupt fraud, stripped naked under the unforgiving lights of his own housewarming party. The sheer weight of his public annihilation finally snapped the last remaining threads of Blake Harrington's sanity. The paralyzing shock that had turned him into a ghost suddenly morphed into an explosive, unhinged rage. His eyes went wide and bloodshot as he stared at the massive digital display broadcasting his ultimate ruin. He thrashed violently against the grip of my executive protection detail, his polished leather shoes slipping frantically on the pristine marble floor. "That is a lie," he screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "He is a crazy old man manipulating digital files. None of that is real. It is a pathetic deep fake." He bared his teeth, completely losing whatever fragile, sophisticated facade he had left, and lunged forward with sudden, desperate adrenaline. He tried to break free from the guards, attempting to sprint toward the acrylic podium to physically rip the microphone out of my hands. But my security team consisted of seasoned professionals who did not tolerate sudden movements. The guard on his right swiftly twisted Blake's arm behind his back, applying a precise, agonizing pressure to his shoulder joint. The guard on his left swept his leg, kicking the back of Blake's knees with calculated force. Blake let out a sharp gasp of pain as his legs gave out completely. They drove him downward, forcing his knees to slam violently onto the hard, cold marble floor right in front of the stage. He was pinned there, panting heavily, his custom silk suit wrinkled and disheveled, forced to look up at me from the ground like the defeated, pathetic fraud he truly was. The grand living room was absolutely silent, save for Blake's ragged, heavy breathing. The elite guests, the venture capitalists, and the tech executives watched the spectacle with cold, unblinking fascination. They were witnessing a corporate and social execution, and none of them dared to intervene. From the back of the room near the audiovisual control booth, the crowd instinctively parted once again. Bradley Cole, my wealth manager and lead attorney, stepped forward. He walked down the center aisle with the slow, deliberate, predatory stride of a legal assassin who had just been given the green light to strike. He wore a sharp, immaculate navy suit, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute professional hostility. In his hands he carried 3 thick, heavy legal folders. The soft thud of his leather shoes on the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a death clock. Blake looked over his shoulder, his eyes wide with frantic terror as Bradley closed the distance. Bradley stopped directly in front of the stage, towering over the kneeling, defeated man. He looked down at Blake with the kind of withering disdain usually reserved for an insect. "You really should have done your due diligence before you decided to forge a signature belonging to the chairman of Pierce Global Logistics." Bradley said, his voice smooth, resonant, and dripping with lethal calm. "You arrogantly assumed you were dealing with an uneducated man you could easily exploit for a quick $2 million payday. You failed to realize that Anton Pierce employs a legal team that can dismantle your entire existence before you even finish your morning coffee." Bradley did not wait for Blake to formulate a pathetic excuse. With a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist, Bradley tossed the 3 heavy folders directly onto the marble floor. They landed with a loud, authoritative smack right in front of Blake's trembling knees. The document spilled out slightly, revealing dense legal jargon, red priority stamps, and official court seals. "This is not a negotiation," Mr. Harrington Bradley announced, projecting his voice so every single investor in the room could hear the absolute destruction of the man who had invited them here. "This is the itemized receipt for your sheer stupidity." Bradley stepped slightly to the side, ensuring the entire audience, and especially Kendra, had a clear view of the legal carnage. He pointed a sharp accusatory finger at the first folder resting on the marble. "That first document is a federal injunction." Bradley stated, his tone clinical and utterly merciless. "As of 20 minutes ago, every single bank account bearing your name, your social security number, or the name of your fraudulent tech startup has been completely frozen by a federal judge. The irrevocable power of attorney you manipulated your wife into signing has been legally nullified due to documented coercion and explicit intent to commit wire fraud. You no longer have access to a single penny, and you are permanently locked out of the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. You are entirely, completely bankrupt." Blake let out a whimper, his head dropping as the reality of his financial death sentence washed over him. But Bradley was not finished. He pointed to the second folder. "That second file contains an expedited petition for divorce filed on grounds of infidelity, emotional abuse, and severe financial fraud. It is already signed by Kendra." Bradley paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "Because you funded your entire marriage using stolen corporate data and forged documents, the prenuptial contingencies have been activated. You are walking away from this marriage with absolutely nothing. You have no claim to her trust fund, no claim to her assets, and you will never see another dime of the Pierce family fortune. You are legally severed from her life, effective immediately." Blake turned his desperate, tear-filled eyes toward the back of the room, searching for Kendra in the crowd. He opened his mouth to beg to plead for her mercy, but she stood tall and unyielding, offering him nothing but a cold, impenetrable stare. Bradley ruthlessly pressed on, gesturing to the third and final folder. "And that last document," Bradley proclaimed, his voice booming with absolute finality, "is an immediate court-ordered notice of eviction. As the sole owner of this $4 million estate, Anton Pierce is exercising his right to remove a hostile, non-paying occupant. You have been legally stripped of your residency. You do not get 30 days. You do not get a weekend to pack your bags. You no longer have the right to breathe the air in this house. You are trespassing on my client's private property." Blake knelt on the marble floor, completely surrounded by the physical evidence of his total annihilation. He had no money, no wife, no home, and absolutely no future. The elite crowd watched him hyperventilate, his chest heaving as the crushing weight of his catastrophic failure finally broke his spirit. He looked up at me, standing behind the acrylic podium, his eyes silently begging for a shred of the mercy he had never once shown me. I stared down at him, my expression carved from stone. "I told you that you did not fit in here, Blake," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "But do not worry. I have arranged an alternative accommodation that is far more suitable for a man of your specific talents." Right on cue, the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens shattered the quiet night air outside the mansion. The flashing red and blue lights instantly illuminated the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting frantic, spinning shadows across the faces of the stunned guests. The heavy pulse of the sirens grew louder and more aggressive as multiple patrol cars tore up the long paved driveway, stopping violently right in front of the grand double doors. The execution was complete. The heavy mahogany double doors at the front of the estate did not just open. They were violently pushed apart. 4 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives strode into the grand foyer with synchronized, undeniable authority. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers outside spilled across the imported marble floors, illuminating the sheer panic on Blake Harrington's face. The elite guests, usually so accustomed to commanding any room they occupied, instinctively stepped backward, creating a wide, unobstructed path for law enforcement. The lead detective, a tall man with a hardened expression and a badge clipped to his belt, marched directly toward the presentation stage where Blake was kneeling in defeat. Gregory Thorne offered a single nod to my men, and they immediately stepped back, releasing their hold on the disgraced host. Blake gasped for air, clutching his bruised shoulder, but before he could even attempt to stand, the detectives were on him. Blake Harrington, the lead detective, announced, his voice booming over the dead silence of the living room. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of first-degree wire fraud, identity theft, and the deliberate forgery of a financial guarantee exceeding $2 million. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The harsh, metallic rattle of steel handcuffs being unclipped from a tactical belt echoed through the sprawling mansion. Blake's eyes darted wildly, his chest heaving in absolute terror as the reality of a federal prison sentence crashed down upon him. He instinctively scrambled backward, his polished shoes scraping uselessly against the floor, babbling incoherent denials and demanding to call his lawyer. The officers did not hesitate. They grabbed his arms with practiced, unyielding force, hauling him roughly to his feet and slamming his wrists together behind his back. The sharp click of the handcuffs locking into place sounded like a gunshot. As the cold steel bit into his wrists, the last remaining shred of Blake's sanity evaporated. His arrogant visionary persona was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, whimpering shell of a man. He frantically searched the crowd, his bloodshot eyes darting past the judgmental glares of the venture capitalists until they finally landed on the vibrant emerald green dress near the arched entryway. "Kendra." He screamed her name, his voice cracking with raw, unadulterated desperation. "Kendra, please. Tell them this is a massive misunderstanding. Tell them we had an agreement. Tell them you authorized the corporate transition. You have to stop this. I am your husband. You cannot let them do this to me." He thrashed weakly against the grip of the 2 arresting officers, begging the woman he had actively planned to leave bankrupt and abandoned just hours prior. The entire room held its collective breath, turning to watch the young woman who had proudly stood by his side all evening. I remained perfectly still behind the acrylic podium, my eyes locked on my daughter. This was her moment. For 3 years he had manipulated her, gaslighted her, and conditioned her to be his silent, obedient accessory. He expected her to crumble, to weep, to throw herself at the detectives and beg for his release. But Kendra did not shed a single tear. She stepped away from the arched entryway, walking slowly and deliberately across the open floor until she stood just 3 feet away from the man who had tried to destroy her. She looked at his sweating, tear-stained face. Her posture was completely rigid, her shoulders squared, and her expression was devoid of any sorrow or panic. I watched a profound, chilling transformation take place right in front of my eyes. The naive, accommodating wife vanished. When she looked at him, her eyes were narrow, dark, and filled with the exact same cold, calculating sharpness that I used to dismantle my corporate rivals. She was a pierce through and through. "I do not know you," Kendra said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the room with the lethal precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "You are not my husband. My husband would not forge my father's signature to steal $2 million. My husband would not use my home as collateral for a fraudulent loan." She leaned in slightly, delivering the final, crushing blow. "And my husband certainly would not be planning to board a 6 a.m. flight to Paris with his chief financial officer." Blake's jaw dropped. The breath left his lungs in a sharp, audible wheeze. The sudden realization that she knew every single vile detail of his escape plan, including his mistress, completely broke him. He had no counter-argument. He had no lies left to spin. He slumped forward, his knees buckling again, completely defeated by the terrifying strength of the woman he thought was weak. The lead detective gave a sharp nod to his partners. "Let us go," the detective ordered, gripping Blake firmly by the bicep. The officers yanked him upright, forcing him to walk. It was time for the ultimate walk of shame. The path from the center of the grand living room to the front double doors was long, completely exposed, and lined on both sides by the city's financial elite. These were the exact people Blake had spent years desperately trying to impress. He had leased expensive cars, bought bespoke suits, and hosted this lavish multi-million-dollar event solely to gain their validation. Now they were his audience for the most humiliating moment of his entire existence. As the police marched him down the center aisle, the modern high society execution began. Dozens of smartphones were simultaneously raised into the air. The bright, blinding flashes of camera lights erupted from every direction. The glowing red recording circles of video lenses tracked his every single agonizing step. Blake tried to lower his chin to his chest, desperately attempting to hide his tear-streaked, panicked face from the relentless cameras, but the officers kept him moving at a brisk, unforgiving pace. The silence of the room was replaced by the continuous clicks of camera shutters and the brutal, unfiltered whispers of the wealthy guests. I heard the sharp, mocking laughter of a tech executive he had tried to pitch earlier. I saw a prominent socialite shaking her head in pure, unadulterated disgust as she recorded the scene for her thousands of followers. The digital evidence of his arrest was already being uploaded, shared, and transmitted across every exclusive network in the state. By tomorrow morning, the footage of his perp walk would be the headline of every financial blog and social circle. His career, his reputation, and his social standing were being permanently incinerated with every flash of a camera. He was not just going to prison. He was going to prison as a universally despised viral laughingstock. As they dragged him through the grand foyer and out the massive front doors, the flashing red and blue lights of the patrol cars illuminated his utter ruin. The heavy doors of the squad car slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside the cage. The engine roared to life and the vehicle sped away down the long paved driveway, carrying the fraudulent visionary off into the dark, unforgiving night. With the primary threat removed from the premises, the chaotic energy of the housewarming party instantly deflated. Gregory Thorne and my executive protection detail moved seamlessly through the crowd, politely but firmly instructing the remaining guests to gather their belongings and exit the estate. The venture capitalists and socialites did not linger or complain. They filed out in a hurried, hushed exodus, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal they had just witnessed. Within 20 minutes, the fleet of luxury vehicles had completely cleared the driveway. The catering staff quietly packed up their silver trays and glass crystal, disappearing out the service entrance like ghosts. The loud, pulsing music had been cut off long ago. The massive $4 million mansion, previously vibrating with fake laughter and stolen ambition, fell into a deep, heavy silence. I slowly stepped down from the raised acrylic podium, my footsteps echoing faintly across the imported marble floor. I walked past the scattered, discarded legal folders left behind by Bradley Cole. I crossed the sprawling, empty living room and stopped right beside Kendra. The brilliant, glaring lights of the digital projector had been turned off, leaving us standing together in the quiet, dim glow of the crystal chandeliers. The mansion was completely empty. It was just a father and his daughter standing alone in the quiet wreckage of a meticulously destroyed illusion. I stood beside my daughter in the center of the cavernous, silent living room. The flashing lights of the police cruisers had long faded into the distance, but the heavy reality of what had just transpired still hung thickly in the air. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Kendra stared at the massive digital monitor, now completely blank, her chest rising and falling with shallow, erratic breaths. The fierce, unyielding armor she had worn while confronting Blake slowly began to crack. Her shoulders slumped and the rigid posture of the Pierce family melted away, leaving behind a terrified, heartbroken young woman who had just watched her entire future shatter. She turned to me, her eyes brimming with the tears she had so forcefully held back in front of her husband and his elite guests. A violent, ragged sob tore from her throat. She closed the distance between us and collapsed against my chest, burying her face into the fabric of my simple black suit. I wrapped my arms around her, immediately holding her tightly, just as I had when she was a little girl waking up from a nightmare. "I am so sorry, Dad." She wept, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I am so incredibly sorry." I let his fake glamour and his empty promises completely blind me. I stood by while he belittled you. I let him trample on your dignity because I was too foolish to see the monster hiding behind his expensive suits. I was so arrogant and I almost lost you. I did not say a single word to stop her tears. I let her cry, feeling the dampness seep through my jacket. I gently stroked her hair, resting my chin on the top of her head, anchoring her in the quiet strength she needed. "You have nothing to apologize for, Kendra," I murmured, my voice a deep, steady rumble in the quiet mansion. "You loved him with an honest heart. His decision to exploit that love is a reflection of his broken character, not yours. You are not responsible for the sins of a con artist." She pulled back slightly, looking up at me with red, swollen eyes. "But why did you hide it?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you let me believe we were just scraping by? Why did you endure his racist, classist garbage for 3 years when you could have crushed him on day one?" I looked around the opulent $4 million room, feeling a profound disconnect from the marble and crystal. I guided Kendra to one of the velvet sofas, and we sat down together. "Before your mother passed away, I began my tone softening at the memory of Camille. She made me promise her one specific thing. We were already wealthy by then, but we kept it entirely hidden from you. Camille knew that growing up surrounded by millions of dollars is incredibly dangerous for a child. It breeds entitlement. It attracts predators who look at you and see nothing but a walking bank account. She grabbed my hand on her deathbed and told me to teach you absolute resilience." I looked directly into Kendra's eyes, ensuring she absorbed every single word. "Camille said that money can buy you a lot of things. It can buy you a massive estate, it can buy you expensive clothes, and it can certainly buy you the attention of a room full of shallow elites. But money can never buy you a spine. Money cannot buy you integrity. Only your character can earn and keep true respect. I hid my empire because I wanted you to build your own identity. I wanted you to know the value of a hard day's work. I let Blake speak to me the way he did because I needed to see if you would eventually recognize the poison in his soul without my money blinding your judgment. I needed you to hit the absolute bottom of his delusion so you would learn how to fight your way back to the surface." Kendra wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, absorbing the heavy, undeniable truth of my words. A new, profound understanding settled over her features. She looked around the massive living room, taking in the remnants of Blake's fraudulent housewarming party. Half-empty champagne flutes littered the marble countertops. Discarded catering napkins and half-eaten hors d'oeuvres sat on the expensive glass tables. The towering promotional banners for his fake tech startup still stood aggressively in the corners of the room, mocking the disaster that had just unfolded. "Come on," I said, giving her hand a firm, reassuring squeeze before standing up. "Let us get rid of this garbage." Kendra nodded, wiping the last tear from her jawline. She kicked off her emerald green designer heels, tossing them carelessly onto the floor, and walked over to the nearest table. We moved through the massive estate side by side, engaging in a silent, methodical cleanup. It was a deeply symbolic process. Every crystal glass we threw into the industrial trash bags felt like we were tossing away another one of Blake's empty lies. Every catering plate we scraped clean felt like we were scraping the toxicity of his presence out of our lives. We walked over to the large promotional banners. I grabbed one side of the heavy vinyl fabric and Kendra grabbed the other. Together we ripped the fake startup logos off their metal stands, folding them aggressively and shoving them into the garbage bins. We moved into the mahogany study, the very room where I had planted the hidden microphone. Kendra did not flinch when she saw the glass desk. She simply picked up his leftover leather portfolios, his expensive fountain pens, and his framed business degrees, dumping them all unceremoniously into a cardboard box bound for the local landfill. We worked for 3 solid hours, shedding our formal clothes and sweating under the crystal chandeliers. We were not just cleaning a house, we were actively reclaiming our space. We were physically purging the infection from the foundation of the estate. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of purple and gold, the mansion was completely stripped of Blake Harrington's influence. The space was finally ours, clean, quiet, and ready for a genuine beginning. The very next morning, Kendra did not waste a single second grieving a man who never truly existed. She dressed in a sharp, tailored business suit, her posture radiating the unbreakable confidence of a woman who had just survived a fire. We drove my old Ford truck directly to Bradley Cole's downtown legal office. She sat across from my wealth manager with a pen in her hand and an icy determination in her eyes. She signed the expedited annulment papers citing gross financial fraud and predatory coercion. She officially filed the injunctions to permanently sever her name from every single one of Blake's domestic and corporate accounts, isolating his massive debt entirely to his own federal file. She submitted the legal request to revoke his access to her medical records, her insurance policies, and her emergency contacts. With every swift stroke of her pen, she actively deleted him from her legal existence. When she signed the final document officially reclaiming her maiden name of Pierce, she set the pen down on the mahogany desk and looked at me with a fierce, unwavering smile. The parasite was officially severed. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. 8 months after the disastrous housewarming party, I walked through the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse downtown. I wore my customary faded flannel shirt and a pair of worn work boots. I took a seat in the back row of the gallery, completely unbothered by the sharp suits of the attorneys buzzing around the room. I was not there to gloat, I was there to witness the final accounting. The side door of the courtroom opened, and a pair of armed bailiffs escorted Blake Harrington into the defendant's chair. The transformation was startling. The arrogant, slick visionary who had sneered at me in my own kitchen was entirely gone. He wore an ill-fitting orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely off his gaunt, emaciated frame. His perfectly styled hair had thinned dramatically, and dark, hollow circles framed his sunken eyes. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a desperate, hollow fraud stripped of his expensive camouflage. He did not look back at the gallery. He kept his eyes glued to the scuffed wooden table in front of him. The federal judge, a stern woman with absolutely no patience for white-collar criminals, read the charges aloud. Wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, corporate embezzlement, and the deliberate forgery of a $2 million financial guarantee. Blake did not mount a defense. He had pleaded guilty to avoid a drawn-out trial he had absolutely no chance of winning. The judge did not hesitate. She handed down a definitive sentence of 8 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole, alongside a mandatory order of full financial restitution. The bailiffs pulled him to his feet and led him away in handcuffs. The book was permanently closed on Blake Harrington. While Blake began his long, miserable stint behind concrete walls, Kendra embarked on a vastly different journey of reconstruction. She did not return to the sprawling $4 million mansion. Instead, we directed Bradley Cole to sell the estate and quietly funnel the proceeds directly into our primary charitable foundation. Kendra moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in the city, paying the rent entirely out of her own pocket. But the most profound change occurred within the walls of Pierce Global Logistics. Despite her status as my sole heir, Kendra explicitly refused an executive corner office. She walked into the Human Resources Department on a Monday morning and applied for an entry-level logistics coordinator position. She wanted absolutely no special treatment, and I made certain she received none. She started at the very bottom of the corporate ladder, working in a bustling, loud regional dispatch center. She traded her emerald designer dresses and high heels for practical slacks and comfortable walking shoes. Her daily routine no longer consisted of upscale brunches and vapid socializing with the city's elite. She spent her days tracking freight manifests, negotiating with exhausted truck drivers, and untangling complex supply chain bottlenecks. I watched her from a distance, observing the remarkable shift in her entire demeanor. The superficial arrogance she had absorbed from her ex-husband completely evaporated. In its place, a rugged, authentic resilience began to take root. She was learning the raw, unfiltered reality of the business I had built from a single rusted delivery truck. She was experiencing the grueling frustration of a delayed shipment and the genuine satisfaction of solving a logistical crisis through pure, unadulterated hard work. She sat in the employee break room drinking cheap coffee from styrofoam cups, listening to the struggles and triumphs of the men and women who formed the actual backbone of our empire. She was earning the respect of her peers, not because of her last name, but because of her relentless work ethic and her refusal to quit when the hours grew incredibly long. The soft, naive girl who had been so easily manipulated by a shiny facade was dead. A fiercely capable, grounded, and fiercely intelligent businesswoman was forging herself in the fires of actual labor. She was finally building a fortune she could truly call her own, constructed entirely on a foundation of unshakable integrity. The destruction of her fake marriage did not just save Kendra's financial future, it fundamentally resurrected our relationship. The invisible, suffocating wall that had slowly built up between us during her 3 years with Blake completely crumbled. For the first time in her adult life, there were absolutely no secrets between us, no carefully maintained facades, and no tiptoeing around uncomfortable truths. We began having dinner together every Sunday evening, not at Michelin-starred restaurants with imported wine, but at the small, worn wooden dining table in my kitchen. We cooked together, recreating the heavy, comforting recipes Camille used to make when Kendra was just a little girl. The scent of roasted chicken and seasoned collard greens filled the house, replacing the sterile, toxic memory of the catering kitchen where her husband had verbally abused her. During these dinners, we talked for hours. We did not discuss corporate takeovers or offshore accounts. We talked about life. Kendra shared the gritty, hilarious stories from her dispatch center detailing her daily battles with stubborn shipping contractors. I shared the stories of my own youth, the brutal, freezing nights I spent sleeping in the cab of my first delivery truck, and the terrifying, exhilarating moments of securing my first major warehouse contract. She listened with a deep, newfound reverence, finally understanding the massive, silent sacrifices that paved the way for her privileged upbringing. The dynamic between us shifted from a protective father and a sheltered daughter to a profound partnership built on mutual, unshakable respect. She sought my advice not as a safety net to catch her mistakes, but as a seasoned mentor guiding her growth. I no longer had to bite my tongue or mask my opinions to keep the peace. I could offer her the blunt, unvarnished truth, and she absorbed it with the grace of a true leader. The pain of her betrayal and the humiliation of the housewarming party slowly faded into the background, serving only as a stark, permanent reminder of the lessons we had both learned. The silence in my home was no longer a heavy, solitary burden. It was a comfortable, secure peace. We had weathered a massive, destructive storm, and we had emerged on the other side with a bond that absolutely nothing could ever break. She was not just my heir anymore. She was my equal, a true Pierce in every sense of the word. After closing the final chapter on Blake Harrington, I found myself standing on the front porch of my modest brick house just as the sun began to rise. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fresh dew on the small patch of grass I meticulously maintained. I picked up the old green watering can from the steps and walked slowly along the flower beds Camille had planted decades ago. I did not move into a luxury penthouse or purchase another sprawling estate. I stayed exactly where I was. I stayed in the home where the floorboards creaked in familiar places and the walls held the genuine echoes of a life well lived. I owned skyscrapers, global distribution centers, and offshore trusts, but this small, unassuming house was the only place I truly belonged. The empire I built was a tool, a shield, to protect my bloodline, but this house was my soul. I watered the blooming hydrangeas, feeling the rough, solid handle of the watering can against my calloused palms. I was a wealthy man, but my greatest fortune was the absolute, unshakable peace I finally felt in my own quiet backyard. The cool morning mist clung to the faded brick exterior of the single-story house. I moved slowly along the narrow concrete walkway, tipping the spout of the old green watering can over the dark soil. The water pooled and sank deep into the earth, feeding the roots of the vibrant blue hydrangeas that lined the front porch. The wooden steps groaned a familiar, comforting tune as I shifted my weight, a sound I had known for decades. The paint on the window frames was peeling in a few places, and the roof shingles showed the distinct, undeniable wear of years of harsh weather. To any casual passerby, it was just another aging property in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. But to me, every scuff on the front door and every crack in the driveway was a testament to a life built with my own two hands. I set the heavy metal can down on the concrete path, wiping a stray drop of water from my forehead. The neighborhood was just beginning to wake up. The distant rumble of a garbage truck and the soft chirping of robins in the large oak tree created a symphony of ordinary, uninterrupted life. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp scent of damp earth and morning dew. There was no imported marble here, no crystal chandeliers, no sprawling manicured lawns maintained by a team of invisible landscapers. There was only the raw, undeniable truth of a simple existence. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing of my porch, feeling the rough grain beneath my calloused fingers, completely at peace with the world I had fought so fiercely to protect. As I stood there watching the sunrise, my mind inevitably drifted back over the chaotic, destructive events of the past year. I thought about the sheer blinding arrogance that had led a man like Blake Harrington to believe he could steal my daughter's future right out from under me. He had looked at this very house, the very clothes on my back, and calculated that I was a weak, ignorant target. His fatal flaw was mistaking humility for vulnerability. I could have easily purchased the most extravagant penthouse in the center of the financial district. I possessed the liquid capital to buy a private island, staff it with 100 servants, and never lift a finger again. I owned a global empire that moved billions of dollars in freight across oceans and continents every single day. Yet I deliberately chose to wake up in this modest brick house every single morning. I chose it because this specific foundation was poured with the sweat of my early years. This was the exact house Camille and I saved our pennies to buy when Pierce Global Logistics was nothing more than a single breaking down delivery truck. This was the living room where my wife taught Kendra how to walk, the kitchen where we baked her birthday cakes, and the porch where I held Camille's hand during her final days. No amount of offshore wealth or high society validation could ever replicate the profound, irreplaceable warmth of those genuine memories. Blake sought mansions and luxury cars to fill a massive, gaping void in his own character. He needed external validation to convince himself he had value. I required none of that. I knew exactly who I was. The ordeal with him was a brutal, necessary storm that cleared away the toxic debris threatening to rot my family's legacy. It forced Kendra to open her eyes and recognize the stark difference between a man who projects an illusion of success and a man who actually puts in the grueling, honest work to achieve it. Surviving that betrayal had anchored us both firmly back to the reality of our roots. My wealth was my armor, but this small, aging house was my undisputed sanctuary. It was the physical embodiment of the integrity I had sworn to protect. The sound of rhythmic approaching footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. I looked down the sidewalk and saw Jason, a young father who lived 3 doors down, jogging toward me in his gray sweatpants and a faded university hoodie. He had a golden retriever pulling eagerly at the end of a leash, its tail wagging furiously in the crisp morning air. Jason worked long hours as a high school history teacher, always waving a tired but genuine greeting whenever our paths crossed. "Good morning, Anton," Jason called out, slowing his jog to a steady walk as he approached my property line. The dog immediately strained toward my yard, sniffing the damp grass near the hydrangeas. "Good morning, Jason," I replied, offering a warm, easy smile. "Beautiful day to be out with the dog," Jason chuckled, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. "You know how it is. If I do not tire him out before my first period class, he destroys the living room couch. Your flowers are looking incredible, by the way. I swear you have the best-looking yard on the block." I thanked him, engaging in the simple, mundane small talk that defined this neighborhood. We discussed the upcoming change in the weather, the recent potholes the city had finally patched, and his daughter's upcoming middle school graduation. He stood there leaning casually against my chain-link fence, completely unaware of the massive, terrifying scope of the power I wielded. He did not know that the quiet, retired black man offering him gardening advice was a billionaire corporate titan. He had absolutely no idea that just months ago I had orchestrated the complete financial and legal annihilation of a corrupt tech CEO, freezing millions of dollars in offshore accounts and sending a hostile predator to federal prison. To Jason, I was just Anton, the reliable old widower who kept to himself and maintained a tidy lawn. And that was exactly how I wanted it to remain. The anonymity was not just a shield, it was a profound comfort. The people in this neighborhood respected me for my character, my polite demeanor, and my willingness to lend a hand when a storm knocked down a tree branch. They did not bow to me because I could buy their mortgages. They smiled at me because we were equals, sharing the same quiet slice of the world. Jason gave the dog's leash a gentle tug. "Well, I better get moving before I am late for work." "Have a great day, Anton. You do the same." "Jason," I replied, raising my hand in a farewell wave. I watched him jog away down the tree-lined street, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of the working-class morning. I picked up my green watering can and turned back toward the worn wooden steps of my porch. I paused at the threshold, taking one last look at the quiet, peaceful street. The entire ordeal with my former son-in-law had validated the most crucial lesson I had learned in my 69 years of life. Never make the fatal mistake of judging a person's worth by the brand of the clothes they wear or the size of the house they inhabit. The loudest, most arrogant men in the room are almost always the most fragile, compensating for a hollow core with flashy distractions. True power does not need to announce its presence. It operates in the background, observing, calculating, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And above all else, be extremely careful of the person who stays completely silent when you insult them. Do not mistake their composure for weakness or submission. While you are busy celebrating your false victory and boasting about your perceived dominance, they are meticulously studying your vulnerabilities, locking the exits and calculating the exact flawless method to end you. True parental love is not about shielding your children from every hardship or buying their way out of the consequences of their mistakes. It is about having the excruciating discipline to stand back and let them fall when they choose the wrong path. If I had rushed in with my wealth the moment Blake showed his true colors, Kendra would have never found her own strength. She had to feel the sting of betrayal and the cold reality of hitting rock bottom to rebuild her character. Sometimes, the most profound act of love is allowing the people you care about to face the fire so they can finally learn how to walk through it. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to remember their true worth today.